I am now a 72-year-old man. This happened long ago, but I remember it so well. The background was a series of events that placed me in a mountain cabin outside of Frederick, Maryland, circa 1969 or 1970. Just say my life at the time was in disarray. I had dropped out of college, my father had died very badly, and I was alienated. I needed to get my mind right. The opportunity to move to an isolated cabin, to live in contemplation and solitude, was welcome. I had some inheritance money to pay for it. To the best of my memory, I was there 8 to 9 months. No TV, but books and radio. I had a library card, and I can't remember if I even had a phone. The story begins when, a month into my stay, a female beagle showed up at my door. She was a lost dog, and I took her in. Never could train her to do anything, but I fed her, and she was a sweet, if not the brightest, dog. A few months in, I began to feel a presence around the isolated cabin. Hard to describe, but I felt like someone was watching. On many occasions, I thought someone might even be looking into my cabin window, watching us. The next phase was the shadowing or following. I knew the folks a half-mile down the lane, woods all around, and would sometimes visit them at night. Something was waiting for me, and followed closely in the woods beside me in the darkness. You could hear it easily, footsteps in the woods, and it picked up its pace as I did. This not only happened to me, but to my younger brother who visited, and to friends, and it spooked them big time. At night, it was out there around the cabin. And here's the funny thing. I was never afraid, never felt threatened. Not at all, at least early on. There was no feeling of malevolence. I spent a good bit of time wandering the vast areas of woodlands around me. There was a state park just up the hill, and the Frederick Municipal Forest went on for mile after mile. The whole of western Maryland was much more country than it is now. None of the development had set in yet. In our hikes, the dog and we came across evidence of campsites, recent ones in the woods, traces of fires, old abandoned buildings that had corners that gave shelter and looked slept in, garbage, food and drink, paper, what have you. Perhaps hunters, but much of it did not have the organized feel that you would get from experienced hunters. The last month of my stay there was when things intensified. Maybe he sensed I was preparing to leave. In the mornings, I would find small dead animals at the bottom of the front porch steps. The cabin had a small front porch screened with a light door and 4 wooden steps to the ground. A spotlight would illuminate the long front yard with woods close by either side. Dead animals began to appear at the bottom of the steps many mornings. I remember small birds, then a squirrel, a rabbit, even a weasel one day, like they were offerings. I had to grab them up before the dog ate them, and this went on almost daily for several weeks. One night, very late, I was awoken by some sound. I lay in bed and heard something from the front porch. I hopped up and hit the lights, and I saw that hound dog who never learned to sit or stay, standing at the front door in a perfect pointer position. She was shaking in fear. She never barked. I heard the door slam and footsteps down the steps. I hit the spotlight but saw nothing. I went out. He had been on the porch at my front door, maybe trying to enter. After that, I stayed in at night more and more. The animal offerings got bigger and bigger. Larger birds, a possum, a woodchuck. It really wasn't funny. The final 2 gifts were legs, either from horses or even cows. Big and bloody. One was skinned, dear God. And the second to last day, the dog left me. I could hear her in the woods howling on a trail following a scent. I looked for her in every way I could. Came up in the following weeks, but to no avail. She left as she came. I moved back to Maryland's suburbs of D.C., got an apartment with a friend, got a job and moved on with my life. One day not long after, I picked up the Washington Post, and there was an article about recent encounters with the Sykesville monster. It's described as a tall, Yeti-like creature, fur-covered, on two legs that would pick out a family or person and give them attention. I wasn't the only one. That attention, described in the article, was exactly what had happened to me, following you at night, looking inside the house, gifts, and so on. I was shocked. If I had turned on that spotlight and seen a Bigfoot or Yeti, I might still be running. But I think I know who it was. Sykesville, Maryland was the location of the Springfield Hospital Center, a large state psychiatric hospital. It was 20 miles or so east of Frederick, and back then, many folks knew how to live in the woods. They grew up that way, country folks. I think the monster was actually an escaped patient, or just a free schizophrenic who lived outside. This is like all the homeless you see in the cities now, probably off his meds, but somehow functional and just lonely. He would pick people or families to adopt, so to speak. The camps in the woods could have been him. Nothing to do, he would make mischief. I think he liked me, but sensed that I was leaving. Now, I can't prove any of this, it's just my theory. My monster was very much of that time and place, and his behavior was what I noticed in nearly every case then. I don't think he could have survived until the 1980s. Deinstitutionalization of mental hospitals threw the mentally ill out into the streets and took away the shelter of hospitals. Unprotected, the mentally ill do die, but once in a while, they find their way to you. A few years back, my then boyfriend and I being a 22-year-old female, were living in a one-bedroom apartment in downtown Denver, about a mile away from the coveted Larimer Square and tourists' favorite 16th Street. The location was fantastic, but with people-dense areas often comes trouble. We live in a historic house with 4 townhouses next to one another. The layout is important to the story. All 4 front doors were aligned on a single porch. The apartment was located next to an alley and was the last door on the left. Due to a work obligation, my boyfriend was sent on a 3-month-long work assignment, leaving me alone in the house with our 2 dogs. No sweat off my back. After growing up in a small town in the Northeast, I was eager to explore. My days after work were filled with long walks around the dog parks and exploring restaurants and craft breweries in downtown. All was well, until it wasn't. Being alone most of the time and raised in a town of 4,000 of my cousins, exaggeration but not really, I was docile and trusting, the worst combination. After a month into being alone in the city, I would come home to 3 men smoking outside my door. The first encounter, I decided to keep walking and called a nearby friend to help me get into my house safely. I thought this was a one-time thing, but weeks later, the men continually showed up. It was routine. When I got home at 5 p.m., they were there lighting up a cigarette, almost like they were there waiting for me. I was finally at my wit's end and asked them if they lived here and whether they could verify that with my landlord. None of them answered, and 2 proceeded to walk down the alley, but one remained stone cold and standing his ground, continuing to smoke. I was upset, and I repeated the question. "Do you live here? Can you verify this?" He stared at me with dark, cold eyes and put his cigarette out on my door, only to brush my shoulder as he left my property. Safe to say, I was unnerved. I reached out to my boyfriend to let him know what had happened, and he relayed the message to our landlady. A few days had gone by since my past encounter, and there were no signs of these men. I felt pretty good about myself. I had taken for granted being able to walk up my apartment steps without being fearful. I had made it to Friday and decided to treat myself to a few drinks with local friends. I had become diligent about locking windows and doors. Being next to an alley made me feel extra vulnerable, and after my confrontation with the porch creeps, I was on edge. My night out was enjoyable, and after a few beers, I decided it was time to go home. Thankfully, a friend of mine insisted on making sure that I got into my house safely. After all, he was the one who had assisted me on a few occasions before. I arrived home and he walked me to my door, but upon arrival, my door was covered in ash and the porch floor in cigarette butts, with the aroma of freshly smoked cigarettes in the air. He could see the fear on my face and offered to sleep on the couch to keep watch, but I told him that I would be fine on my own. I stayed up a bit longer, double-checking locks and pulling my blinds down. After about 20 minutes, I retreated to my bedroom, which faced my front door, being sure to keep the door ajar so my Rhodesian Ridgeback could be aware of anything happening outside my door. After a bit of Netflix, I finally dozed off, until 3 a.m. when I awoke to my dog growling. I was petrified. Something in me knew tonight was the night he or they would be back. I got out of my bed slowly, trying to make as little sound as possible. I peered out my door and saw a single hand on the stained glass window and a pair of eyes peering in. Sure enough, he was back. I had unfortunately left my kitchen lamp on, exposing my house to the outside world, and knew if he saw me, it was game on. Slowly and quietly, I made my way to the lamp and turned it off so he could no longer see me, which ensued terror. The man, appearing to be shirtless and yelling slurs at me, began pounding on my door, demanding entrance. I retreated to my room and called 911, who told me to stay low, avoid interaction, and to stay on the line until the officers arrived. I couldn't stand to watch him punching the window because I knew it was a race between him and the officers for whoever got to me first. Finally, there was a loud crash. I peered through the door crack to see that he had upgraded from a hand to a brick, causing the glass to begin cracking. I remember vividly, it had been almost 10 minutes on the phone with dispatch at this point, with officers 10 minutes away from my home. After a few more brick throws, I watched him scale the porch to my window, continuing to try to obliterate the glass, leaving the cracks in his wake. And then there was silence. I once again looked toward my door to see him looking back at me, cigarette in hand, until the cops arrived. I was told to wait for a knock on my door, which finally came, and to tell me it was safe to come out. I made it outside just as they were putting him in the back of the vehicle, which he yelled, "Bye, Pete." This shook me to my core. Only my family referred to me as that, and they were thousands of miles away. I realized that he had been watching, listening, waiting. He probably knew my boyfriend was gone, and most likely heard me refuse to have my friend stay here. I watched the vehicle drive away and called whoever I could get a hold of at this hour. Come morning, my mom finally called me back and told me to get in touch with officers and press charges, something that entirely slipped my mind during the mayhem. I called them back and asked them to get the paperwork, only to be told that he was put in the hospital and ran off before properly identifying him. Two to 3 years ago, I was 20, just an Egyptian guy studying law in the nightmare period of finals, barely getting any sleep or any showers. This is important because that meant my beard grew a lot and looked nasty, and my hair poofed into soft curls, and I pretty much looked like trash. For this story to make sense, I'm going to give you some background. About a decade or half a decade ago, there was this political group called Muslim Brotherhood. They are made of Islamists, so you are thinking long beard and very religious views, almost extreme religious views, so a coup disguised as a revolution took place, and the guy who led it marked them as terrorists to remove any major political parties that can stand in his way. That means if you had a long beard, you were probably hunted, imprisoned, killed, tortured, or a mix of all of them. Years pass and things are much calmer, and 20-year-old me is anxious, stressed, and nervous. I do not want to fail my exam. If anything, I wanted good scores. So here I am looking like absolute doo-doo with very messy beard and hair. I am almost late for finals, and I am walk sprinting while reading my notes again and again and again, and this guy in civilian clothes asks me to stop. Obviously, I don't. I'm in a hurry, and I'm very nervous, and the last thing I need is to lose my focus. So he tells me that he's a cop, and now I am too nervous, and I ask him in a very nervous way, "What? Show me your ID." And he says to just come with him. You can only imagine how I feel. Firstly, I'm pretty much shaking by now. I didn't do anything wrong. Why would I be stopped? Am I going to be sent to the police department? What about my finals? And there's also this very good chance that he could be someone dangerous. He starts grabbing me by the arm, and I yell at the top of my lungs for help. Nobody helps, they just look at me and pass me by. The guy then grabs me by the neck with his elbow and drags me to an empty cafe. I thought to myself, yep, I'm gonna die today, and started whispering my prayers. I get told to calm the F down, and they sit me down, and the supervisor and his team, they're all in civilian clothes, and the supervisor basically yells at me, either you shut up, or I will send you for 3 hours of investigations at the department. Your choice. I'm now shaking and almost on the verge of tears. It was a humiliating experience. They take my ID to inquire about it, and I keep explaining I have a law exam and that I need to get to, so they tell me to stay still and be quiet, or they'll make it take longer. Luckily, one of the cops was very kind to me. He kept asking me questions about the exams and looked at my notes to talk to me about it and was just very nice. Here's the thing. I had no idea why on earth I'm being searched up. At least I didn't until they dragged another much older person, but with a long, and I mean Gandalf long beard, and they asked him about the Brotherhood, and then they asked me why have I grown my beard, to which I replied, I don't really have time for hygiene, I have finals. Then they asked about my family and asked if I had any relatives or if I knew anyone who was in the Brotherhood. I told them that I do not know anyone and that my family and I tend to keep to ourselves. When I realized where this was going, I decided to show them my phone. I mostly had rock and metal music, and the people here have the misconception that metal's the devil's music. It was worth a shot, and I don't think they would have accused me of being a devil worshiper. They finally finished checking on the database and give me my ID back, and they literally asked me a question that left me speechless. Why did you scream for help? I can't really tell them it's because they dragged me forcefully, can I? So I just told them that I got mugged this way before, and they literally all just laughed at me. I actually ended up apologizing to the supervisor because this took place about 10 minutes away from where I live, and the last thing I needed is being a target. I finally made it to the exam room, but I'm a whole hour late. I couldn't enter with a note, so instead of stashing my notebook, I was too angry, so I just threw it away and entered. I solved all that I could, but honestly, I didn't have the focus. Every time I wrote something, I kept having flashbacks of what happened, so when I had enough and made sure I solved all the questions I got, I just wanted to go home. I only got a passing mark for this subject. Sometimes this memory pops up from here and there, and every time I do, I remember the humiliation I felt back then. I don't think I could have done anything differently back then, which just makes it worse because that probably means if I am faced with this situation again, there would be nothing I can do unless I have a higher power than them. I've lived in Utah for most of my life, other than a few years in Wyoming. I'm an Uber Eats driver in Utah and have been for a couple of years now. What I'm about to tell you took place about 5 days ago. I had just gotten finished with a shift of delivering food and was on the phone with my mother when I got the bright idea to go looking for a former apartment that we had lived in when I was younger. Now, normally I carry my new 9mm on me, but that was at home. So I decided that I would go home to pick it up so that I don't have no defense if I get into a bad situation. My mother had done some research on the address of the apartment. The apartment used to be called Midtown Villa and was never full of gang activity when I was younger. So I had typed the address into my Google Maps and drove over there. I pulled in and realized that the apartment is now called the Calaveras, and everything was now looking better than it used to, so I let my guard down, which looking back on now I regret. I started polling through the apartments with my mom on the phone, which we had then agreed that I could put her on video chat so that she could see the new upgrades. I had pulled back through the entrance off the main road and started showing my mother the building that used to be our apartment building, and I was pointing at the building and empty lot next to it. That empty lot used to be a playground when I was a kid. First mistake. I was using a phone to show my mother, which made it look like I was recording. Second mistake. I was pointing. Third mistake. I was in a bad area and let my guard down. Now, why did I tell you those mistakes? Because what I didn't realize is, while I was showing my mother, I was passing a guy and a girl and pointing. Now I know all that alone doesn't seem bad, but apparently I angered someone who must have thought that I was recording them. Even though I had my 9mm with me and a loaded magazine, I had made some odd choices due to the fact that I'm a very direct person. As I continue forward, I realize that I'm being chased by the guy who is now on foot after me. He's yelling at me, calling me out and asking if I wanted to tussle after a while of running towards me and taking photos of my car. Now, before realizing it, I was suddenly moving forward faster in my car, and my mind was made up. I was getting out of there and driving off. Now, the events that are about to take place are due to the fact that I have some extensive training outside of others' knowledge, even though I had let most of that slip. My adrenaline was pumping, and instead of harnessing it, I mistakenly let it control my actions. With my mom still on video chat, I suddenly took notice of a car pulling up fast behind me. I took off out of there. The car was then behind me. I turned right. They turned right. Same turn I made again, they followed. So I went up to 9000 South and took a right after stopping, thinking that I was just being paranoid. Nope. They followed me all the way to 1300 West, and that's where I turned right again, and guess who followed? Now, I'm not going to lie. I was very nervous with multiple scenarios playing in my head because I knew that I was in a bad situation. I knew that if it came down to it, I had my pistol. I know what you're thinking. Dial 911. Well, I'm the type of person who rarely does that, and I wanted to get out of this on my own. While all these scenarios crossed my mind, I suddenly got the bright idea to turn right onto 7800 South, so I did, and then they did. But this time, a semi had gotten between us, right behind me. I was happy until the semi had turned left. Then I knew I had to figure out what to do next. My next decision was to turn left. I approached the next light in the left turn lane to get on the road that leads to 7200 South where the I-15 on-ramp was. What I didn't think about was what would happen if they followed me. What will happen next will make you reconsider not asking for help when you need it if you're like me. I turned left, they followed, and sped up on my right in that lane, so I immediately swerved over after turning my signal on and got in front of them, because let's face it, if they get next to me, it could be game over. So I slowed down a little, then they got in the left lane and sped up next to me. So I sped up, and just as we hit 90 miles per hour as well, I slammed on my brakes and they slammed on theirs and turned right. If I had been there, I could have been hit and rolled my car and even died. At the very least, I would be in hospital. That's when they took off down the road on their right, and I booked it to the interstate, drove to a grocery store near my house, and called the police department near the apartment complex to report it. The dispatcher then informed me that I should have called 911 to make the situation easier, and they would have directed me to the nearest police station with officers outside to deal with anything that followed me to the parking lot. The officer then called me, and we talked about it, and he had gone on to tell me that that area was very problematic with gang activity. He believes that my extreme concern and judgment were very accurate, so I had made the report just to make it before anyone else had, so I knew that I wouldn't get a knock on the door at some later point. So I then headed home and didn't let my guard down until I got home and knew that I was safe. I told my fiancée about it the very next day, and she told me never to deliver in that area without some form of protection. So in closing, number 1, don't ever leave yourself without protection. Number 2, Always ask for help when you need it because otherwise your life could be at stake. Number 3, don't be naive to your situation. I hope this doesn't happen to anyone else. And also just remember that it's not the people with pistols in their holsters that you have to watch out for. It is people who tuck them into their waistbands without a holster that you have to watch out for. Be safe, and thanks for listening. This happened when I was about 12 years old in Kansas. I was sitting in my bedroom playing Halo. My parents were both running errands, and my sister was at work, so I was home alone with my 2 dogs, a little terrier and a Bichon Frise. Not exactly the attack dog breeds, more like early warning systems at best. I'd been home alone before, and it really was not a big deal. We live in a pretty safe part of town that's never had any problems, other than one time where some people sprayed some hate symbols on some public park equipment. But either way, I was kicking back in my chair, Doritos in one hand, controller in the other, full gamer mode, when I heard the very distinct sound of my door open and close like someone had just come in. The room I was in faced in such a way where I could not see the front door. My dogs got up and ran into the living room, and so I just assumed my parents were home. I shouted for my mom to confirm this, and I heard no response. My dogs were also not barking like they normally do when someone gets home. I thought that was kind of weird, so I paused my game and walked out into the living room. Nothing. I felt the hairs on the back of my neck stand up. I heard someone come in, clear as day. I was not wearing headphones. I had the TV turned down and was listening to music, so I knew it couldn't have been the game. I immediately went to my parents' closet and grabbed our shotgun, like a good Midwest boy tends to do. The only problem with that was that I didn't know where my dad kept the shells, so my plan was to fake it and hope they didn't have a gun of their own. Stupid plan, as I wasn't the brightest kid, obviously. At this point, doubt started to kick in. Had I actually heard the door? Was it the game? But then I thought, why would the dogs jump up like that if it was? I walked back into my living room, unloaded shotgun, pointing it in front of me. I tried to call my dad. He didn't pick up. I tried to call my mom. She didn't pick up. I tried to call 2 of my best friends, and they didn't pick up. My 12-year-old mind immediately jumped to, oh my God, they're all dead. And so for the first time in my life, I had to call 911. The operator picked up. I explained the situation with tears in my eyes from fear. She told me to stay calm and that the police were on their way. The difficult part about staying calm was that there was a hallway by my front door. I knew in my heart of hearts that there was someone in that hallway about to jump out and really mess up my day. My 2 dogs were right by me, also staring towards the hallway. This didn't help the fear. I stood there rooted to the spot of what felt like an hour but was actually only a few minutes, the operator's voice in my ear telling me to stay calm. Thankfully, my parents opened the front door. They screamed out, asking me what in God's name I thought I was doing. I explained to my father the situation we are currently in. He grabs his pistol from the front room. Didn't know that was there, thanks Dad, and we go a-hunting. I always thought it would be cool to go around clearing rooms and stuff like a SWAT team, but God, if I wasn't about to soil myself every time we opened the bedroom door. We didn't find anything. The police arrived shortly after and told us that this had been happening over the past few weeks. People wait until homeowners leave, check the door, and if it's unlocked, they go in and take valuables. They said whoever it was probably left when they heard that someone was home, which never quite sat right with me because I only heard the door open and close once. Ever since this happened, I have triple-checked every door and window lock when I am home alone. To whoever walked in my house that day, I never saw you, and I really hope I never do. This story took place about 2 years ago. I was about 16, 5'6", who either looked like a 12-year-old boy or a 16-year-old tomboy depending on the person. At the time as well, I suffered with really bad anxiety, and you could definitely see it on my body language. I was definitely visually an easy target for predators. So I was a 16-year-old kid just picking up hardbacks from my last year in school. After I had done shopping, I decided to catch a tram back to my dad's workplace, and then he would take me home. It was a Sunday morning, pretty chilly, and it definitely had an uneasy feel. I hated going to a town alone, but no one else was available to join me, so I sucked it up and did the deed. The trams were new at the time, and I had only taken them 2 or 3 times, so I was definitely hypervigilant on them, especially since I suffer with anxiety. Hypervigilant so I didn't miss my stop, and hypervigilant that nothing weird happens, as the tram was notorious for weird people. I walk to my tram stop, and as I wait, I see the next tram is soon. But there's a guy making me unbelievably uneasy. I hate assuming the worst of people, but this man was making me so uncomfortable. Nothing in particular was off about him. He looked a bit scruffy, but not a predator. So I decided to walk away from the stop for a bit and wait for the tram coming to pass, then return and get to the one after. They come often enough, and this dude was just giving me the creeps. I walk away for a bit, take a nice relaxing stroll to calm myself down, and return to the stop. He's still there. When I left, he definitely watched me leave and waited for me to return. Now at the time, I was doubting myself. I was telling myself I'm being irrational. Something like a creepy dude following me couldn't happen to me, surely. Wrong. We got to the tram. My tram takes about 5 stops to my dad's workplace. I walked down the tram a bit. The man was still in my eye line, and I was in his. Now, my dad's workplace is about a 5-minute stroll from my tram stop, but it is a walk down a quiet area, an area that someone could easily assault you or take you, and not many would take notice, especially on a Sunday morning. At each stop, I am praying that this guy gets off the tram, but he does not. My anxiety has hit the roof, and although the tram walk is only 5 minutes, I call my dad to pick me up right outside the station. My dad surprisingly obliges. I think that he could tell something was off with me, so all I have to do is walk out of the tram station and make it to the car. I still had hope in my heart that this guy would not get off at my station and go to the next instead. It comes to my stop. I get off, and of course Mr. Creepy gets off too. No one else gets off but us two. All right. The guy looks at me and I look at him. We make eye contact. I could tell he was planning on walking in my direction and following me out. I can see him panic a little, and then he walks in the opposite direction to me. Now the chilling part is about this. This station only has one exit. This man turns around and walks onto the tracks of the tram and just wanders off. I didn't stay too long to see if he would come back, and I sped walk to my dad's car. When I get into my dad's car, I double-check with him that there was only one exit to the station, as the tram is only new and I was unfamiliar with it. He says, yes, there is. Only one exit, and I'm completely covered in goosebumps. This man waited for me to get onto the tram, even though he could have taken an earlier one, followed me to the station, and decided to last-minute abort mission. I have tried to rationally explain this to myself. Maybe he wasn't following me and he was just some weird dude, but why did his presence make me so uneasy that I decided to walk away and wait for the next tram? Why did he wait for the next tram when he could have gotten an earlier one? What are the chances of the man getting off at the same stop as me? Why did he not use the exit and walk onto the tracks instead? It's not like I gave him a death stare. We just made eye contact when we got off the tram, and I was a 5, 6, 16-year-old kid. Definitely not intimidating. All I know about this experience is that I was just glad my dad picked me up outside the station, and I never want to experience that feeling of being followed again. So I'm a female, and this happened when I was very young, maybe 14. My life had gone pretty haywire, and I didn't spend a lot of time at home. My parents had filed for divorce, during which time my mother had kind of lost it and had allowed me to do pretty much whatever I wanted since she was going through plenty in her own life and mind. Then my dad suddenly moved back in, and that all came to a screeching halt, and I wasn't too cool with it. So my reaction was to stay doing whatever I wanted anyway as much as possible, which ended up getting me quite literally thrown out of the house permanently, but that's a whole other story. So I had 2 friends that I hung out with normally that were about 4 years older than me and had just graduated high school, and at the time I think I was still lying to them about how old I was. They were both 18 and I told them I was 16 when I was actually 14. We planned on a camping trip without any definite destination, but being that we lived in Colorado Springs, the mountains and vast possibilities for potential camping spots were only a hop, skip, and jump away. So we headed west into the mountains, in 2 separate vehicles and several other people. One of which was this gigantic guy that I didn't like much and always gave me the creeps, and since this was 25 plus years ago, I can't honestly remember his name, so we'll call him Brian. So about halfway up the mountain, one of my 2 friends realizes she left something important back home and needs to turn back and go retrieve it. So me and my other friend and our carload of people, including Brian, continue on our way up. We make it to the middle of nowhere in the mountains and still have no clue where we're going to camp, so we're more or less wandering around in the woods on dirt roads with civilization a distant memory. And our car breaks down. And to make matters worse, right around that time it begins to rain. But since we're already prepared to camp, that's what we do overnight. Brian is sitting with us the next morning and pulls out a handgun he says he stole from the parents of one of the girls that's in the other vehicle, and Brian goes from being creepy to downright scary. Because not only does this guy seem to have a very short fuse, but now we also know he's armed with a deadly weapon and we're stranded with him in the middle of nowhere. So we all decide without Brian that we should watch what we say to this guy and try to keep him from blowing a fuse on us. All of us now muddy and dirty from setting up tents in the rain on the side of the road, we decide that we shouldn't just sit there and hope that our caravan returns and is able to find us. So we pack up our gear and get back on the road and wait for someone to pass. And not a soul does. So we start walking, all 4 of us and all of our camping gear, till we make it to a paved road. After an hour or 2, a truck finally comes into view on the highway and we all flag him down. We explain what had happened and ask for a ride to a phone, and the guy graciously loads us and all of our gear into the back of his truck. We finally make it to a phone and call our friend, who tells us for some reason that I can't remember now, that she had decided to just not go with us and to stay in town. But she does agree to come to where we are and pick us all up. When we finally make it back, the friend that came to get us tells us that she had spoken to the girl whose parents Brian had stolen the gun from, who had been in her car, and she told her that Brian had gone on the camping trip with us because he had shot and killed someone with that gun, and he was trying to hide out. I imagine that had been the actual reason for her having decided to not come, but it had also left the rest of us stranded in the middle of nowhere with a killer still armed with his murder weapon. Thankfully, though, we are finally back in civilization unscathed, alive, and I believe the guy did end up being arrested a short time after that, but dear God, did realizing I had been literally stranded in the middle of nowhere with a murderer for 3 days hit me like a ton of bricks when it was all over. Hey friends, thanks for listening. Click that notification bell to be alerted of all future narrations. If you got a story, be sure to submit them to my subreddit, r/Let'sReadOfficial, and give and receive feedback from the community, and maybe even hear your story featured on the next video. And join my Discord to interact with me and other listeners directly. And if you want to support me even more, grab early access to all future narrations for just $1 a month on Patreon, and maybe even pick up some Let's Read merch on Spreadshirt. And check out the Let's Read podcast, where you can hear all these stories in long compilation form and save huge on data, located anywhere you listen to podcasts. Links in the bio. Thanks so much, friends. And remember, Do, re, mi, fa, sol, la, ti, do.